All right, awesome. This is going to be fun. Welcome, everyone. Hopefully, you should be able to hear Jeff and myself. Welcome to CMS Philly, formerly Drupadelphia. You're in the 2 o'clock session on the community track, and this session is a review of the results of a annual Drupal developer survey that Jeff and I have been running for the last couple of years. And we've presented this session a few times at DrupalCons and Drupal camps in the past. This is the first iteration for this year's survey that it just completed. So we're going to be talking through a lot of the cool statistics that we managed to pull up. So before we begin, I'm Chris. I'm one of the organizers of CMS Philly. I'm a recovering Drupal program manager and developer. And with me is Jeff Geerling. Jeff, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I am somebody who's done lots of Drupal stuff for 11 years now, and I maintain some Drupal modules. I have developed probably over 100, 200 Drupal sites, many large, many small, all kinds, and so use practically every dev tool, practically every code editor that I've ever heard of. Almost everything on the survey that we've ever had, I've used. So I have a keen interest in the results of the survey, and Chris kind of helped get it started a few years ago, and I'm glad he has, because it's been helpful just to see where things are going, and all that.
So a reminder to all the attendees, we'll unmute everybody in just a second. If you have any questions you want to pose to us at any time, feel free to just jump in and interrupt us. It's also probably easier just to pose your question in the little questions panel. There's a question mark icon. You can post a link there and we can answer it and let them pile up. And of course, there's the Slack channel, the 2020 Developer Survey results channel. So feel free to join that and post your question in there. Let's get into the nitpicks of the survey results. We sent out a survey, a Google form a couple of months ago. Let's talk about first who answered this survey. This is always kind of fun because then you get a good sense of where everybody's from. Not to dwell on this too much, but a lot of folks from outside of the US, from all over the place. The darker the color, the more responses we got. But very pleased to see that we had a good representation from all time zones, which is fantastic. Outside of the US, the biggest contributors, not surprisingly, English-speaking countries, Ireland, UK, and Canada. The rest of the EU rounding things out, and good representation from the rest of the European continent. Good representation here by Australia and India as well. So let's not forget them. Within the US, kind of where the folks, where the population kind of matches as you would expect with where the respondents are. Biggest, let's say, tech-heavy states have the most responses: California, Massachusetts, Illinois, Ontario, TDOT, Washington State, and of course the Mid-Atlantic region. Out of Canada, Ontario really leapt ahead with a lot of responses this year. So that was kind of nice to see. And you can clearly see Jeff's impact here on Missouri.
I called every single person that lives in Missouri and uses Drupal.
Nice. All right, so we've modified questions over the last few years. In years past, we had some vague answers like some Drupal 8, a lot of Drupal 7, some Drupal 7, maybe a little bit of 6. We were very blatant this year, just Drupal 9, Drupal 8, Drupal 7, Drupal 6. And as you can see, only a smattering of Drupal 9 and a smattering of Drupal 6. And clearly everyone's working on Drupal 8. There's a handful of you that are probably struggling to convince your customers to migrate up to 8. And you're burdened with maintaining a Drupal 7 site, but this is really nice to see this progress. This has changed a lot since last year. I think we were roughly 50-50. Let's go to the tape, shall we? Ooh, I don't have the 2019 survey. We'll take our word for it. All right, next question is, how big is the team size that you work on? The questions here are really around how many people were working besides you? Is it just you, meaning one, you and one other person, two, and so on? These numbers, this is actually 2020 and 2019. So you can see where we clarified the point of making this one or two people. But comparably, you can see that more people are working in mid-sized organizations now, right? This green represents 6 to 10. That's about the same number, but a smaller proportion of the total. We had slightly less responses this year than last year. I think we had about 60% of the total responses that we had last year. But fractionally speaking, you can see how this has shifted. Interesting.
I was just going to note that on the previous slide with the Drupal projects, the results last year, since we had different questions, it was a little more complicated, but it did seem like it was more like a 60-40 split between Drupal 8, Drupal 7. So
yeah, yep. And not surprisingly, I guess, there are no large Drupal organizations in Oceania. So that's reflecting on why we don't have any numbers of groups of 10 or 10 or more. Also of note, Asia encompasses India, right, which is known for having large SI type organizations, and that reflects those numbers here. A large segment of these responses are from larger groups, less individuals. The next question talks about the other Drupal developers on the team. We'll come back to that in a minute. We want to just break these out now into another dimension. So this is part of the fun part of this project. Now that we have all of these responses, we can measure them against each other and categorize them to see, hey, where are the lone wolves working? What are the larger teams working? And what kind of projects are they working on? Again, the majority of folks are working on Drupal 8, but you can see it's the smaller teams that are also the ones still responsible for a lot of the older projects, which kind of makes sense if you think about it, right? We're the single and pair developers. Those are the ones that are more likely to be maintaining older sites, probably for smaller customers. That's what I would deduce from this. The other dev team is now questions about, let's say, folks that are on your team that are maybe more specific DBAs, front-end UX design, content developers, I don't know, even just site builders, maybe not so much as a content administrator, not so much as a Drupal developer. But what is not surprising here, oh, and I lost my top row, I just realized this is the same number, other dev team size of 1, 2, 3 to 5, 6 to 10, 10 to 25, and 50 or more. But the idea here is this green band across the middle is basically showing this is above average responses than what we'd have expected, which just basically reinforces if you have 3 Drupal developers on your team, you probably have 3 to 5 other developers on your team. If you have 1, you probably have 1 other person that you work with. If you have 50, you probably have 50 other non-Drupal developers that you work with. So this just basically confirms that data. One thing that is of note here, the trend that is interesting is again, the mid-size is the only one that's kind of held, and mid-size and larger has held steady over the last few years. The 3 to 5 is growing. So it doesn't seem like a lot, but from those other screens that we saw here, this is that light blue group. I don't know if this is still about the same size. I think it's really more the 6 to 10 has the biggest jump, but that's definitely a noticeable shift from previous years. This segment, the mid-size agency, let's say, that's growing more. All right, fun stuff. What are you using? What are you working on? So the questions we asked, the responses are basically across, what you would expect. Are you on a Linux machine or are you on a Mac? It's pretty much one of those. If you're on Windows 10, you are definitely in the minority. If you're running Windows 7, don't. Or some other distribution of Linux. But it seems to be Debian, Ubuntu, Red Hat, a smattering of you, or Fedora. But vast majority are using either a Linux, Ubuntu, or Debian, or a Mac OS base, not surprising, 3/4 or more. Again, comparing to the team size, not surprisingly, the larger the team, it seems to be more likely that you're on a Mac. We know, of course, the Pantheon folks, Acquia folks, everybody there is working on Macs, but people are still bringing their own machines and working on Linux machines at the same time. You're still 3 out of 4 are using those two. No surprise
And
there.
I wanted to mention too that it seems like, so I maintain one of the projects that's in one of these questions, Drupal VM, which does support Windows, Mac, and Linux. And a lot of the dev tools do support all three. But something to keep in mind if you do use Windows or if you're considering what computer to purchase for your development needs, the fact that over 70% of people, maybe over 80% of the people that are building things locally and using Drupal are not using Windows makes it a little bit harder unless you're very skilled at knowing how to use Windows and run open source software on it and all that. It makes it harder to get things done sometimes. So something to keep in mind, and I'm not saying that you need to buy a Mac necessarily or buy Ubuntu or whatever, but you need to know what you're getting into basically, because a lot of times somebody that will be trying to get stuff running on Windows that isn't really made to run on Windows, and then you find out you need to learn a little bit more about getting WSL or some other stuff running on your Windows machine. And for some people that's fine. For other people, it might save a lot of grief just to use a Mac or use a Windows laptop that's running Linux or work inside of a virtual machine or something like that.
So one other interesting thing here is now comparing the team size to the projects they're working on. So what are the larger teams working on? What are the smaller teams working on? Drupal 9, we don't really have a lot of data here, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. But between the 8s and 7s, you can clearly see, sorry, not Drupal team size, the operating system. Between Drupal 8 and 7, you see there's not too much significant difference, but this is also the Linux Red Hat group. They're the ones that are represented much more strongly. But you look at Drupal 6, and that's what's really interesting to me, that a majority of those are using not Mac OS, they're working on Linux. So they're really the diehards, I guess. This group of 22 here, wherever you are, you're the hardcore guys holding on. So time to upgrade. All right. So what are our respondents using for code development? Actually, you know what? Let's take a pause here and see if anybody has any questions or comments that they want to raise. We'll unmute this for everybody. Hopefully this will work. I think I have to let everybody unmute individually. Give me 1 second.
You can also leave questions in the question and answer thing too, that way you don't forget it if we get to the part where you want to talk.
I'm doing this now because it's a good time to do it. Hopefully I got everybody.
Oops.
I think I have to do everybody manually.
Huh.
So warning everybody, I'm unmuting you. So if you're in a noisy place, remember to mute yourself. But this gives everybody, you'll have the flexibility to mute or unmute yourself as you see fit. So just I want to make sure everybody has a chance to ask questions if they want to. Okay. Let's keep going.
GoToMeeting gives ultimate control to the presenters, apparently.
Yeah, which is awesome. GoToMeeting is one of our sponsors of CMS Philly. You should check them out at gotowebinar.com. So, all right. Sorry for the shameless plug. Let's keep going. So what is everybody using for code development? No surprise. IntelliJ and Visual Studio, again, are at the top of the pack. I think this was a little closer last year, if memory serves. Let's go to the hard data, shall we? And that was really what was for us.
Actually, it looks like PHP Storm had a bigger lead last year by about 5 or 10% more over Visual Studio. And Visual Studio was a little closer to Sublime. So it looks like Visual Studio is increasing and PHP Storm is very slightly not increasing.
Yeah, so if we just look at the ranks from last year, PHP has always been #1, but Visual Studio has been one, yeah, like you said, has been creeping up. Sublime, the top 3 have been pretty, top 7 have been really pretty stagnant. What's been really interesting though is the lower half, the stragglers, so to speak. BB Edit has really jumped ahead. Emacs has held on. Eclipse, Coda, roughly about where they were. TextMate has dropped. Brackets came and went. And then everybody else below that, these are really now the single responses that we're getting. This is the long tail of all these other tools that people are using. We're trying to just look at the top, but the battle here between, I'd say, Eclipse and BB Edit, I'd say, game on. So we'll see how that pans out.
Yeah,
But this, it's the long tail, really, literally here. So
yeah, I think it's always interesting to note too that I think you might have a slide on this coming up, but in terms of when you're doing Drupal 8 or Drupal 9 development, the style of development sometimes caters towards a little bit more structure, and so PHP Storm becomes a lot more useful in that case. You can get plugins for Visual Studio, Sublime, even Vim, Atom, other things like that, but PHP Storm does have that really deep integration and a lot of Drupal plugins and PHP plugins that help it be more productive. So something to consider if you're ever considering jumping to another code editor.
yep. I guess the other question is, the cost, right? The best things in life are not free. So how much of a consideration is that? If you're working in a larger organization, you probably are getting enterprise licenses. That's got to have some impact here too, to skew some of these results. If we take all the large teams out, and we'll come to that in a second, you definitely can see that disparity. So again, to your point, Jeff, about let's say the projects that they're working on, what tools are they using? Again, the top 2, no surprise, but you can see the older the project, the more likely that they're using something like Vim or Notepad or Sublime Text, right? So
Notepad++,
not surprising.
which is
Notepad,
much different than
sorry, Notepad++. Now, in terms of the operating system, this is not a surprise, right? The folks on Red Hat are not using PHP Storm. They're using Visual Studio Code and Vim and Atom. The folks on Windows 10 are not using any of the command lines. Looks like they're only using Visual Studio and PHP. But Mac, over almost 3/4 of you are using one or two of the other of those top 2 leads, and you're not using. Only a tiny handful of you are using the hardcore command lines. So now, team size. This is really where things show, right? Again, thinking you're going to get an enterprise license, so you're more predisposed to be using something like IntelliJ or PHP Storm, and that's true. Over half of those users are using it there. On the single lone developers, where now that licensing cost might be a factor, this is where all the representation of the other tools comes out. I think that's the driving force here, more than anything else. The free tools versus, or the shareware, code for beer type things, that's really going to come into play.
Yep.
All right, now you've done all your coding, so who's checking your work? That's the real question. We've kind of stuck to these questions, and not surprisingly, this hasn't changed too much, but it definitely has evolved, and I'll jump to the hard numbers for this, but our responses were pretty much limited to these choices. Pure code review, QA tests, the developer doing their own tests, code sniffing, a senior developer's reviewing, some unit testing, no QA. Who are you people? Why don't we just code on prod? Doing some Behat testing or doing QA tests on production, which to me is like nothing, winging it also. Now, the order of these here is what they were last year. So you can see continuous integration has jumped from 4th to 2nd now, which is great news. kudos to you folks for getting your Jenkins workflow in place for whatever you're using. But it also
I'm gonna mute Peter.
where is he doing? Okay, good.
No, I got it.
Okay, good, awesome. So one thing that is interesting. This the continuous integration has jumped up several spots, but also importantly, it's not as obvious here. But the senior developer or developer performing their own tests, that's the yellow bar and the blue bar, those have dropped much lower than they were last year. They're roughly ranked the right place, but the number of responses here is much lower. So those two, again, you're not going to do it as much if you have continuous integration in place. But those are the top three, right? You're still having somebody review probably as part of the pull request process. You're doing QA tests on a pre-prod environment, good, and you're using some sort of continuous integration tool. So finally, the top three are really mimicking the recommendations that or best practices that you've been hearing about for the last few years. It's finally caught up. So good job, everybody. QAing. So where are people QAing and how are they doing it by project type? Of course, let's not look at Drupal 9 too closely because we only have a handful of responses here, but the disparity between 7 and 8 is obvious, right? You're not going to be doing as much continuous integration on 7. That's why there's only one of you doing it. Similarly, doing any kind of other automated tests like code sniffing or linting, again, huge difference between 130 and 3. You can see that massive effect that's having. So that's putting this, that's putting the squeeze on the developer having to do their own tests. They're still doing it, but the majority are doing still code review and tests on a lower non-production environment.
I think a big driver for that has been the composer support in Drupal because a lot of it is around it's hard in Drupal 7 sometimes to get a site set up, to get all the development tools integrated with it. In Drupal 8, a lot of times, like getting PHP CS to lint your code, which is like super easy to do and an easy way to catch little bugs before they even become bugs sometimes. And it's probably like ground zero of doing continuous integration testing. In Drupal 8, you just run a composer command and you have the library, and then you can run PHP CS on your code base. With Drupal 7, you'd have to like install it globally and have a command and kind of hack things together and build a script to do your stuff. And it could be done in Drupal 7, but a lot of times it wasn't like run these 2 commands and you're done. So that's been a huge boost. And I know for myself, I had a session earlier today talking about my own website. And I don't have much set up for Drupal 7, but for Drupal 8 I do because Composer just made it super easy. Like there's no excuse not to now.
Yep. So now, look, I have a spotlight now. I forgot I had this tool. One other interesting difference here. Nothing winging it is heavy on Drupal 7. So I guess it's those people that are like, yeah, you know what? It's a Drupal 7 site. Whatever. Do we really need to check? A lot of you seem to think so. So I think that's kind of funny. All right, now, oops, that means I have to turn that off, don't I? Okay. How about by team size? What are the lone wolves doing versus the larger teams? Not much difference, honestly. I mean, the biggest teams are not doing their own tests. They're relying on the integration, not surprising. They have probably multiple teams, so they have the ability to do a senior reviewer. That seems to be a greater segment. But overall, it really, the best practices are in place and they're being followed pretty roughly the same across team sizes. Local is your favorite picture, Def. I couldn't have the heart to change this. Yeah.
There's an atom, but it's a little blurry in this picture. You can't really see it.
Right there, tiny little. That's going to be the Drupal 6 site by itself one day. All right. So local development tools. This is really the meat of this survey we wanted to get to learn. And On top is the results from 2020. On the bottom is the results from last year, from 2019. So this is really a better comparison side by side, where different tools were in place. One thing to note, even with the difference in total N responses, the disparity, the tiering or plateauing of responses is way more evident here this year than it was last year, where it was just kind of a tail trickle off. Yeah, kind of use these tools. You're very much falling into one of these camps, right? So you're using Lando, you're in the Docker doc sale camp, you're in DDev, maybe you're still using Drupal VM, or you're in this other group, and then there's the long tail, starting with Lagoon and Lamp and Aegir and so on. But
Just one quick aside
yeah,
here is that Acquia BLT, a lot of those people are probably using Drupal VM as the backend, so that could affect those numbers. And there are some other things where people, I think, sometimes get confused by this question, put Docker when they're using Lando or Docker when they're using something else. So you have to take this graph with a grain of salt and notice that it's like building surveys is extremely difficult. So making the results be perfect is also extremely difficult, but it gives you some good trends. You can see some things definitely happening year to year.
Yep. So, I mean, if you just look at the, let's say the general groups, if we look at this second group, Docker, Doxel, DDev, all the Ds, Drupal VM, of this group, Homebrew has definitely trailed off. This was like, hey, we're going to use Homebrew. That dropped off. We're at less than half of the responses than we had last year for that group. So that's one notable drop down. One other one here is we've aggregated the quote Docker / custom Docker. We still consider it the same group. That is still the number 2 spot. But Doxel was, pretty not too far behind, but far behind. They're neck and neck with Docker now, which is interesting. DDev has jumped way up, has doubled the number of users, and they're in that same group. So definitely a lot of shifting around. This has been evolving pretty quickly among let's say the top 5. One note for me, I think this really reflects the passing of Drupal 6 and 7. I kind of associate those with the MAMP users. I feel like if you're using a newer machine and you're using something composer based, you're probably more likely to maybe have a Docker VM running than MAMP Pro. And I think that's really what you're seeing here too. So this has dropped down into the bottom of the 3rd tier here, where it was maybe at the bottom of the 2nd tier last year. The long tail, though, these are roughly the same. Some notable changes here. Lamp, Lagoon still remain at the top. Nginx is still here with Tokaido. Outrigger hanging on, Drop Solid hanging on. Those are all roughly about the same place. So my interpretation is it's the same users. They're still using it. They're still responding to our survey. So thanks, guys, for continuing to participate.
And they will never change. In 30
They'll
years, they'll still be on it.
Eager.
Drupal 6.
All right, so we took the top 10, 11 or so and mapped it out by region, because this is kind of, well, it's pretty colors, so that's what I like. But it's also interesting to see where those users are, right? And you're gonna actually see this later when we talk about hosting. It's kind of interesting. But not surprisingly, Lando is heaviest in the Americas. A good proportion in Europe, but that's what's weighing into this overall total. What we're not seeing here that we do see, let's say in Asia, are some of these other long tail, what we would consider the end of the 2nd tier. These last bottom ones, they're better represented here in terms of proportion, right? So Acquia Dev Desktop, the WAMP XAMPP group, and the Drupal VM. These are the guys that are representing a larger number of their total segment. The other thing between Americas and Europe that's definitely noticeable is the users using Docker and Lando. The proportion between the two totals is the same, but much different disparity. It's like 4-3 one way in Europe and probably 4-2 for the Americas.
I also have to wonder sometimes too. I know some of these tools are more localized for different environments, and they also have like champions or that kind of thing in a region where they kind of promote it. And so it's something to keep in mind if you're developing a tool. So let's say you're somebody working on Lando or DDEV or Drupal VM or whatever. If you can find ways to make your tools more accessible to a wider range of an international audience, you can get more people who are happy to use your stuff in other regions too. And there are some groups have done. I mean, obviously there's time constraints, there's resource constraints, and there's sometimes physical constraints that can prevent that. But a lot of kind of more not corporate backed, but tools that have more corporate backing in general can sometimes get more sessions in it on local Drupal camps and get regional Drupal cons, big Drupal meetups and things. They can do more work to promote things, and that can also affect the numbers. I know for Drupal VM in particular, it saw a large boost when it started being used for Acquia BLT, because all of a sudden a lot of Acquia-based projects would start using Drupal VM just because it was kind of included, and that was a lot of large enterprise customers, that kind of thing. So the numbers, as always, they're swayed by a lot of different factors, but I think it's interesting to see the regional uptake and see which tools are used in different parts of the world.
So, I mean, to that point, a classic example here looking at this is Docker for Drupal. 3/4 of the respondents are from Europe. So that kind of jives with your theory there, right? There's some cluster of users here, probably at one or several agencies, UK or in continental Europe, but that's the majority of these users, and that's skewing the results for them. It's also surprising to me to see how few users are using Doxel or DDEV in Asia. I don't know why, but just kind of interesting. All right, how about by team size? Again, this is probably more interesting because this really reflects the enterprise level organizations. They have some sort of shared services, possibly internally. They have systems, they have enough people to build systems, and that's probably going to reflect on the tools that they're using. So the largest organizations are least likely to be using something like Lando, more likely to use something like Doxel or Vagrant or Acquia BLT. I wonder who these guys are. So I think the biggest jump here really is between 1 and 2. The folks that are using DDEV, there's a huge disparity there. The rest of these segments are roughly the same, maybe for Acquia Dev Desktop. Then you get into the midsize. These are all roughly about the same. The next jump is definitely by team size. The Doxel group is the driving force here with the larger groups. So we go back to by region, right? Where's my region? What happened to it? There we go. It's by the majority of those users is Europe and the Americas, right? Which is the majority of our users to begin with. But Americas is really skewing this. So there are some large American entities, agencies, organizations that are pushing Doxel. So we've got Doxel in the Americas versus Docker for Drupal in Europe. The battle is on. All right, by project type. There was one thing I wanted to note. Oh, no Drupal VM for 7. Tell me why, Jeff. Oh, you're mute. We lost your audio.
Something's a little strange about that. I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
it's funny because Drupal VM is typically used a little more for older projects, just because with Drupal VM, there are ways to install like PHP 5.6, 5.4, even 5.3. I've actually had people I want to use PHP 5.3. It's like, just stop using that, please.
Yeah, please. But they're all seem to be the 7 guys are on Docker, or Lando or Vagrant. That's the majority of those. But What is kind of nice, and this was the heart of doing this survey right here, this slide. Look at this Admiral's medals band of representation. There's no single clear majority with Drupal 8. That is amazing to me. I mean, 9, and we're only talking, what, 4 people here. It's Docker or Doxal. But for the Drupal 8 projects, so I don't know if this is just because people are using multiple tools and it's been spread out so evenly, but we had like 600 respondents, and that's basically saying across how many groups do we have here? 10, 11. It's roughly, you have a 1 in 10 chance of using the same tool as somebody else is using. That's
Yeah, I
amazing.
think that's a blessing and a curse, because one nice thing is almost any use case you can imagine, there's one of these tools is more focused on that particular use case, whether it's, deep integration with a cloud provider, or the ability to be fast on your local environment, or the ability to like work with containers a little easier. But on the flip side, unlike many other communities that have one preferred tool, and then there might be some other custom ones that are less used, for a beginner, you might be like, okay, I want to use this, and then you find another blog post. It's like, oh, this shows me how to do this thing, but it's for this other tool. So you switch tools to another one, and then you get that working, and then you want to do something else. So it creates a little bit of that friction, and part of that, I mentioned it again in my session earlier today about migrating my own jeffgeerling.com site. It's like when I want to choose a local development tool, I'm like, each one of these offers some good stuff, but like, what is the value proposition over me building my own Docker container? There are some here and there, but then again, like if I have 2 of them installed, sometimes, like I think it was an issue with either DDEV and Doxel or Lando and Doxel, or I had 2 of them, and I started having conflicts in my Docker, and I'm like, okay, I give up on that, and I went back to a custom Docker, and I think that's what some people do. So that's one area
Yeah.
where I think having a little bit more of a preferred solution someday might be nice. And if you just go by numbers, that'd be Lando. But it's hard to build consensus in the Drupal community over this, because we are a very open source community, and some communities are not like that. When you have somebody like Dries who's more open-minded and like, I want to have all these options out there, that's a lot different than someone who's very hardline and saying like, I don't care about that or that, and I don't care about your feelings. I'm just gonna pop this down as the one solution. So it's been an interesting thing over the years to see evolve in the Drupal community.
So Jeff, we do have one question from Jeff St. Pierre. Does BLT allow for Lando and DDEV backends too?
Yeah, I put in the answer there that it does. There's a documentation page that has the official supported backends, and it allows Lando, Dev Desktop, or Drupal VM. The Dev Desktop support is there, but I know that there's some issues if you do a lot of more advanced Drupal-y things and have Drupal 8 sites. So it seems like a lot of people defaulted to Drupal VM, but I know that Lando support was added a year or 2 ago, and a lot of people have been moving to that. That's why I said in the earlier slides, it's hard to tell with if they answer Acquia BLT, does that mean they're using custom Docker with it, which you can, DDEV, which you can, but it's even if it's not officially supported yet, Lando, Drupal VM. So those numbers, that's one interesting case in here, along with the Docker response. Like if someone uses Lando, they could say they use Docker because Lando uses Docker. But of course, they could be using Docker Machine. I think there's still a mode that you can use it in with Docker Machine. So it's always complicated trying to do a survey like this.
So one thing I want to do, let's go back to the local code development tools here. For me, it's interesting. Okay, so this is our raw data we're looking at really quick, and what we're trying to do is segment out, right, where these groups are, who the users are. But again, looking at the responses here, this dichotomy, I must be missing a segment here. We'll have to look at these numbers because I don't think it's this close in the Americas. We have such an inordinate high number. I'm missing numbers here. So I don't know if we're missing responses. I'm just realizing the totals. We may have to go back and check this. Okay, Let's talk about hosting. This was a new area that we added. We have not asked before. This was part of the feedback when we delivered this in Seattle. Is that where we were last year? And one of the questions was, hey, can we correlate some of this with what people are using for hosting? And Jeff and I looked at each other and were like, yeah, duh, why not? So we added the question. So this has really been interesting to me. I am a little surprised at how aggregate this data has ended up. So one of the responses we gave people, because we recognize that you may work with an organization or you may have a customer that has their own internal solution, whatever that is. You may not even know what it is. Maybe you're supplying files to them and you don't even know, whatever it is. So customer's own, far and away leading provider, which again, just kind of reflects you're doing work not for yourself or your own site, like Jeff and his site, let's say, but you're doing this where the money is, right? You're doing this for customers that are paying you to develop, design, administer, maintain, keep your website alive. What I am surprised by is how much that represents, meaning knowing that's one option. Acquia and Pantheon are number 2 and 3, very closely behind that. And then we drop off very quickly with AWS, Amazon hosting, or Platform SH. If you're not in one of those top 5, then you're really in this long tail. And the top 3 in that group are very close together: DigitalOcean, Amazy, and Azure. I'm surprised by Azure because you'd think if everybody's on a Mac, wouldn't they? I don't know. Whatever.
It's for those. It's for those 20 Windows developers.
The Windows 7 guys.
Yeah.
And then there's the rest of that. Let's call it the second tier. Linode, Contigix, Google, and GoDaddy. GoDaddy is still around, believe it or not. People are still using them. No offense, Google GoDaddy users. And then we have a very, very long tail of providers. And I had to draw a line somewhere, so we snipped it at 2. But you get a
We got
sense.
a couple questions in here too. So we just noticed that DigitalOcean and DigitalOcean are split. So DigitalOcean
Oh,
is actually
yeah, you're
34,
right.
and
Thanks for
our own and customer's own should probably be together, but that's not as big a difference. But it would give a clean 230. But it's in
Yeah,
VPS
I
is
put
probably
our
in
own
there
as
too.
our own as the provider, looking at the notes, because the survey respondents could pick 3. What are the ones that you use the most? So this is a weighted average, not a 1-to-1. So
Yeah.
because that makes sense, right? You're working with customers and you're more likely
Yeah.
follow where they are, and this way we get a good statistical sample. But yeah, we'll update that. So DigitalOcean then bumps it up it still remains at the top of that second tier. So thanks for calling that out. But our own, I think I interpreted as meaning the company, the development, the Drupal agency's own solution. Maybe they have something, white labeled, they're
Yeah.
using and reselling. That used to be the trend, I think, prior, we're talking 10
Yeah.
years ago.
There's still a number of agencies, like I think 10.7 does that kind of hosting model.
Right, but 10.7 was one of the responses too, right? But they're in
Oh,
the long tail. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a number of them, right? Something Magic, a whole bunch of these that HostGator, they're in that mix. And yeah, we can actually show that so you can see, you believe me when I tell you this.
Again, this was one question we allowed write-ins. Is that, didn't we?
Infomaniac, that was another one.
Yeah. So you
And there was
get some answers that are very long tail.
Yeah, so here we're getting into, 1&1, Alibaba, HostMonster, an IBM Cloud user out there, Media Temple, Scaleway, Cytosquidix. Yeah, some of these guys are, I've heard of them, and they're very probably either regional, some affiliation with the agency, but the top list will definitely combine these two. Okay, so let's take a look at this now by region and by team size and by project. Last thing we want to look at. Again, some regional spread here, not surprising. AWS has the largest representation among Asia users. Interesting. Within the US, it's really a tie between Acquia and Pantheon. The customer zone is really now Europe. That's the weighting here. So if we look at it from a region only, Pantheon is actually number 1, Acquia is number 2, customer zone is number 3. How about that? Acquia. Interesting. It's the reverse for Asia, and it's the reverse for Europe, non-customer zone. But Acquia is in a tight race with AWS here. So that's pretty interesting. All right, sorry, let's see other questions we've got. Is there a distinction between customer zone and our own? Yes, I think I mentioned that. We'll just reiterate. A customer zone, meaning you're working with a customer, they're providing that to you. Maybe you don't know what it is, they just give you access, although I think you could figure it out. Or maybe you're just providing files to them and they're taking care of the upload or the design. I'm not sure. Our own, I interpreted as there's some affiliation between, meaning it's the development company is also doing hosting. So it's our own hosting, right? So I'm running Jeff Geerling web design, and I also have Jeff Geerling web hosting. Between Acquia and Pantheon, what is the plus and minus of those companies? In terms of being a hosting provider, I'm assuming is what the question is. Well, I mean, probably number one, you get size. Let's say pros, you're getting a support team depending on the hosting arrangement you've got. So there's always the 24/7 support backup, right? If you're doing it your own or using AWS, who's administrating and keeping an eye on those servers? So there's definitely something to be said for that. But that also means a con, right? That probably means additional cost. Those are probably the first two things I would look at. So it depends on the customer's budget. Always comes back to that.
I think also the spirit of that question might also be like between Acquia and Pantheon, comparing the two. I mean, it's really hard because each platform offers different things, and every customer is different. There are people who might have a better fit with Pantheon. There are people who might have a better fit with Acquia. Same thing for any of these other setups. Like for instance, I host my personal site on DigitalOcean, but I only do that because I am an infrastructure person and know how to manage that. If I didn't have somebody on my team who knew how to manage VPS servers or the services that are required, I would definitely use a service like Amazy or Pantheon or any of these other ones that are set up for Drupal. And it really depends on what you're comfortable with, what your budget allows, all those kind of things. Or even if you need to scale massively, some of the services are better for that and some are worse for it. And not everybody has a site that gets 50 million visitors in 1 hour on one day of the year. But if you have that, you might have needs that push you towards a certain solution.
One thing that's worth noting too, both Pantheon and Pantheon and Acquia, sorry, have free hosting tiers, right? So you can try them out, see what their control panels, their UI is like. They're definitely very different. That may also give you some better context into how easy it is or intuitive they are to use and work with. But yeah, I mean, your best option is to explore all your options depending on what your skill sets are. As Jeff said, you may not be infra experienced. That may be something to consider. Having something that's a little more managed might work to your advantage. Okay, let's keep going because we're almost out of time. I want to make sure to see if we have any other questions. Hosting solution by team size. Again, not surprisingly, the largest segments are, let's say, the single or pair, I don't want to call them freelancers, the individual developers versus ones working with larger groups. The larger groups are tending towards Acquia and Pantheon and AWS. That kind of jives with what we just said. You probably have some team members, right? Remember, the larger teams are likely to have other developers on the team. They probably have infra hosting engineers, platform engineers, DBAs that can help to manage that. That makes sense, and less likely to be using customer zone. This just, from my perspective, it kind of reinforces it. What is interesting though is the drop off pretty quickly. You see how small these segments are of those second tier. Even DigitalOcean with those numbers, they're not represented in the largest segments. Only GCP, which makes sense, and Platform SH are the only other two that show up in that high-end group. All right, last is by project type. Again, looking at just the difference between 8 and 7. So nobody's really using Acquia for Drupal 7 sites. They're probably doing their own customer own solution. Again, that kind of falls into the notion of you're helping support this customer's site. They've been running it for the last 10 years on whatever they've been running it on, and you're just continuing to administrate it. It's either there or it's on Pantheon, and Pantheon definitely has had a tendency, has been more friendly to the smaller customers, right? Acquia is usually thought of as the more enterprise level likely, or a good mix of it. That just kind of reflects that here. And again, outside of AWS and Linode here, filling out the rest of the group, there's none of these other providers in this space. All right, let's see, any other questions? I think that is it. I can't believe we managed to get it done in 53 minutes, Jeff.
Yeah, and
not
including
too
all the
bad.
questions and answers. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we made it, everyone should be available to raise a question or have any comments or any other things you'd like to see from the survey, recommendations for what we want to add to next year's questions. Make sure to click below and subscribe. Make sure to let us know. We'll be in Slack. Send us a note here. You can reach us both on the Drupal Slack channel. I'm just Chris in Drupal Slack, and Jeff is Geerling guy.
Geerling guy. Yep.
Drop us a line and let us know if you have any other feedback you'd like to see on this survey, and we'll try to incorporate it for next year. We'll post a PDF that has a little more data and details behind all this stuff after we fix our little DigitalOcean, apologies guys, update those numbers. But thanks for attending. Does anybody have any questions or comments?
Matthew says, thank you guys.
You are welcome. Thanks for coming to CMS Philly, Matthew.
And Randy Fay has cloned himself. I see him twice in the attendees list.
And that's still not enough. The world needs more Randy Fays.
I mean, if we want Dita to take over the world, I think we need like 6 of him.
All right. If no other questions, we'll let you guys go. This is where I switch hats and tell you, as a CMS Philly organizer, thanks for attending the session. Please jump over if you have time, if you haven't already signed up for the raffle that we're giving away, some lifetime subscriptions for WordPress training and Drupalize Me subscriptions. Those are great things to have, even if not for you, for other folks on your team that you think can use. Sign up. They've been sponsors for us and really helped us out this year. And you'll also get a link for a follow-up survey after the whole conference is over later today. Make sure to take a few minutes to take that survey. And then the last thing is, we'll be doing in this channel, the room number 4. Join us at 4 o'clock. We'll do a I don't know how this is going to work, but we'll try it. We're going to do a virtual happy hour. We have some fun ideas set for that, so feel free to join us for that.
Bring your Diet Dr. Pepper.
Yes, bring your Diet Dr. Pepper. All right, everybody, thanks so much, and thanks for joining, and have a great day.